Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. My name is Olivia Tuller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You're welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on March 14th with Bob Taylor. He will be giving a presentation on United States research with the Family History Guide. If you would like to access the previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Sara Cochran on Grandma Said What? Gathering and Verifying Your Family's Oral History. Before we begin, here is a little bit about Sara. Sara is a full-time professional genealogist with over 28 years of research experience. Her research has taken her into nearly every state in the USA and Ireland, Italy, Austria, and Britain. She especially enjoys breaking down brick walls for her clients, discovering the stories of Black sheep ancestors, and helping individuals preserve their photographic legacy. Sara holds a Boston University Genealogical Research Certificate, a bachelor's degree in library science, and is an alumnus of the ProGen Study Group. She is a member of multiple lineage societies, the Association of Professional Genealogists, and the Genealogical Speakers Guild. She also volunteers at the National Archives Riverside office. You can find her online at theskeletonwhisperer.com. And we'll now turn the time over to Sara if she's ready.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining BYU and myself on this evening, afternoon, morning, whatever time it is where you're tuning in from. As mentioned, this is being recorded, so you guys can rewatch it. So I do ask that there be no other screenshots or recording of the presentation. And I'm going to talk to you about my favorite part of genealogy, and I think something that most genealogists and family historians really, this is the point of it. It's, yeah, names and dates are great, but what we really want are the stories. We want to learn the stories. We want to understand who our people were, and hopefully we now want to kind of go through and see how accurate those stories are that have been passed down generation on generation. Now, for fun, I titled it Grandma Said What? But this applies to any family story you've received from any source. So we're not picking just on grandma. I have, the standard issue 2 grandmas, and I love them both dearly. And I'm not picking on them or anyone else in that group, but well, we'll talk more about how we want to be careful with those stories that are passed down. All right. So what exactly is oral history? Well, Merriam-Webster comes in and helps us out and defines that as information of historical or sociological importance obtained usually by tape-recorded interviews with persons whose experiences and memories are representatives or whose lives have been of special significance. Alternately, a book, article, recording, or transcription of such information. I personally think that people in my family have special significance, to me personally. But of course, this is also folks who are representative. Now, I like this definition. I don't think it goes quite far enough when we apply it to our family histories, our genealogy. So let's take a look at a similar concept, oral tradition. Dictionary.com defines this as a community's cultural and historical traditions passed down by word of mouth or example from one generation to another without written instruction. And I think that's a little bit closer for those of us who work with oral history and do genealogy and family history. I think we're kind of looking at a blend. So this is my personal definition. The as yet unconfirmed stories and details of our ancestors' lives, which have been told to us or left behind by our elders and family members. So any kind of detail that we've received about our families that we can't kind of document yet. So that means that there's a lot of types of information which can be considered oral history. So including dates of birth, marriage, death, divorce. If we haven't, kind of found something to document that yet, then until we do, it's kind of oral history. where a family was from. Now, whether that might be like, oh, we came from Kansas, or oh, we were from Prussia, specific state or country. Family connections to famous individuals or famous events. There's one in my family where my immigrant Irish family was in St. Paul, Minnesota, the day that Abraham Lincoln was shot. Still working on that one. We get the wild tales, the ones that just don't seem like they could possibly be true. And sometimes the information on photographs. Okay, somebody wrote, grandpa on the back of the photograph. Well, which grandpa, right? So why is oral history important to us? You're joining me for the evening because you want to learn more about this. Well, so why do we care? Well, this is how we get hooked, right? We grow up hearing about, you know, Grand Uncle Lawrence, who was at the beaches of Normandy, or how our Nap ancestors have ties to Anne Boleyn. Yeah, that Anne Boleyn. And we want to learn more. And sometimes we really hope the stories are true, giving us kind of that brush with the rich and famous, or it's just a fun story. Sometimes we kind of hope the stories aren't true. And I've got an example of that later in the presentation. For many families, though, memorizing and sharing the stories orally and the details was the only way to record their history. And this happens for a variety of reasons. So who might have relied on oral history to preserve their stories and their family legacies? Well, individuals who lived in times and places where records were simply not kept. I've got lots of Irish ancestors, and there are no birth, death, or marriage records, at least at a governmental level, until 1845. There's some church records before that, but we got a lot of missing records. Individuals who were enslaved did not appear in government created records, or at least most of them. They were banned from learning to read and write, so they couldn't create their own. There are no family Bibles for these folks, or very, very rarely. Individuals who didn't have the access to or the resources required to get an education, so they are illiterate or partially illiterate. I think don't have time to go to school. You got to keep the farm going. Those types of things. Individuals who live in places where records were destroyed, whether that's they were burned, flooded, lost, blown away in a windstorm. Missouri courthouse, they got hit with that one. So all of those types of situations and more. But more than that, the oral record contains information and clues that no other source possibly could. We're just not going to find those details in those government created records, even if they're there. So a marriage record can tell you who officiated the ceremony. It can't tell you what flavor the cake was, right? So it's those types of details, what everybody was wearing and what what they had for the meal and those types of things that were, add depth to our family history, and the oral history is where we find those details. So how do we get it? How are we going to gather it together so that we can work with it? Well, we got to open our ears and really listen to our family when they tell those stories. And we want to get into the habit of interviewing them as well. Now, we want to start with the oldest living generation that you have available to you. So grandparents, their siblings, so granddaunts and uncles, your parents, their siblings, so your aunts and uncles, your own siblings. My mother was one of 8, and every single one of them will tell you that they were all raised by different parents, even though they're all close in age. Every child's going to have slightly different experiences. On my dad's side of the family, there's almost a 20-year age gap between the oldest and the youngest. So that youngest sibling has heard stories that my father never got to hear from their parents because they were too busy, raising this big family. And he experienced things that she wasn't alive for. So they have different stories to tell. They've heard different things from their parents. And let us not forget about all of our cousins, no matter how closely or distantly they happen to be related to you. They may have heard a slightly different version of the story, an entirely different version of the story, or maybe even in the same one. And especially, as we're making new friends through our DNA matches, it's sometimes very interesting to hear that the exact same story or a very similar version of the same story has kind of come down through different lines of the family tree. It's like, is that really coincidence that we're all getting the same version of this? Let us not forget about our fan club, the friends, associates, and neighbors of our deceased loved ones, and even some of the living ones, as they may be able to share stories or photographs with us. Okay, and sometimes those friends, associates, and neighbors are going to be willing to tell us the stories that our parents and their siblings and our cousins aren't willing to share. Yeah, sometimes you never know. And we also want to make sure to interview ourselves. This is especially important if your parents or some of those other folks are already over visiting with the ancestors. They've already passed away. So I encourage you to take some time and write down what you remember being told. Okay. But make sure to make notes who told you the information and when and under what circumstances, just as best you can. So it's not too late. We can create that written record by writing down what you remember. And most importantly, write down your own personal history. Let's not do to the people researching us in 2 or 3 generations what our ancestors have done to us. Let's kind of pay it forward a little bit. Now, this is an idealized order. Okay, if you had equal access to every person on your list that you want to interview, then yeah, let's start with those older generations first. Get the ones that are maybe not in good health, get them first. But if your oldest generation lives 3 states away and you won't be able to visit them for 6 months, it's perfectly okay to start with somebody who you have easier or more immediate access to. My family is strewn all over the country, whereas my dad lives 3 miles away. So I can go interview him. I don't have to wait until I get through everybody else to go talk to my dad, right? It's also perfectly okay to start with yourself. Get some practice with the techniques we'll be talking about today and work on creating your interview questions. And sometimes if you're sitting there, you're writing down the stories that you remember being told. If there's other people on the list that also heard that story, then you can say, well, this is what I remember. What do you remember the story being? So you can kind of get some of that conversation going as well. All right. So speaking of interview questions, let's talk about the types of questions we want to ask ourselves and our family and how to get quality responses out of even the most tight-lipped member of the family. All right. So we want to spend some time thinking about what we want to know. Right. This just like when we sit down to do our traditional paper research, we have a question that helps us focus in and find information that can help us get the answer. So this can be information about your family in general, or about a specific person or a specific event. All right, so you're going to write down those questions. And while you're crafting your questions, you want them to be vaguely specific. So you want them to be, both specific, but kind of broad. For instance, don't ask, what was your mother like? This is going to get you the deer caught in headlights response and maybe a shrug, like, she was my mother. I don't know, she's a normal person. You might instead ask something like, was your mother an early riser or did she like to stay up late? So still kind of specific. We're kind of inching in. We want to know what mom was like, but also kind of vague, the room to maneuver within that and giving them a little bit of a lead. You also want to make sure that your questions are open-ended. Don't ask something, instead of asking, did you serve in the Marines during World War II or did you serve in the Marines during Vietnam, which might get you a simple yes. Maybe ask something like, what was your mother's reaction when you told her you joined the Marines during World War II? That might get you, now it still might get you a short, like, well, she wasn't very happy with me, but it might kind of open that up a little bit and get a longer response. If you're having trouble coming up with questions to ask, an internet search for family history questions will give you more ideas than you can shake a stick at. I have given you some of my favorite question prompt resources in your handout. So yes, you have homework. But look through your family tree. See, I always wish I want to know more about this individual. I want to know more about great-grand aunt Bridget, who might have stories about Bridget, and start, kind of work on it that way. Now, our interviews don't have to be fully dependent on questions that you have come up with on your own or that you found on the internet. We can use other items to start conversations and get useful tidbits of information out of our loved ones. Photographs. You got photographs? I got so many photographs. My grandma Alice became the keeper of the family photographs, and unfortunately, most of them did not have any identification on them. Once I realized that was the case, I made it my mission to get as many of them identified as humanly possible, because my grandmother was the last person alive who could identify them with confidence. So I started scanning. Every time I visited, I literally, it was in my carry-on bag, or not my carry, my checked bag. I hauled my scanner with me and I just scanned my little, so my fingers fell off. And then I went home and I ordered reprints of those so that we could handle them and even write on them without having to worry about damaging those originals. And then I went through and I just got some El Cheapo labels, little return address labels to run through the computer. And I created kind of a code number. And my system was the first initial of the family surname and then just a number. I affixed a label to each photograph. At this point, the code numbers really have no specific meaning. There's no order to them. This is random which one's called R122. But on my next visit, I took the reprints and my recorder. And once my grandmother was settled comfortably, I handed her a photo and said, please read off the code number, read the number on the back, and then tell me what you could. And she did a very good job at following her instructions. So later, when I went around to transcribing those recordings many months later, I was able to quickly locate each photo she was describing because I could reference it back to that code number. Very helpful when you have approximately 100 pictures of her parents just just the two of them. So, you go along, it's like, oh, well, this is my parents. Okay, which specifically, or this was, these are my parents at such and such an event. Okay, that doesn't narrow it down, but if I have a code number, I can match it all up. So that was in my opinion, a brilliant idea. It's been very helpful. We can also use heirlooms and other items to prompt questions and spark memories in your interviewee. Even pictures of long gone items, such as toys, cars, farm equipment, can spark memories and yield valuable information. I have also had some success in learning details about events using newspaper articles as prompters. So this clipping is from July 1913, and it tells how A.D. Holland was thrown from a mower and injured in that process. And I asked his daughter about this. I said, well, did he ever mention anything about, I read her the article and said, did he ever mention anything about this? Now, looking back, that wasn't a very good question because she could have stopped at yes. Fortunately, she was of Irish descent and we don't know how to give a short answer. So I got this beautiful detail about how A.D. had said that's why he couldn't dance the waltz properly, was that he'd kind of cut a tendon in the back of his heel. He was thrown from the mowing machine. Do you know what a mowing machine looks like? This is on a farm. And she meandered off into a discussion about the mowing machine. But eventually I kind of brought her back to the original topic at hand. And I said, oh, well, because I have this thing about correlating dates in my head. And she goes, oh, so this was a little bit more than a year before he married your mother. And I got this beautiful detail. A little over a year later, he married her. They were probably seeing each other at this time, and he used to go to Aberdeen with the buggy and take her to school again on Sunday afternoons. So she was a teacher before they married. I mean, you're not going to get that kind of good details and then those little fun things anywhere other than the oral history. And since this was the lady's parents, I figured that was pretty likely to be accurate. All right, so we have a list of questions. We have, maybe some prompters, photos, other conversation pieces assembled. Let's talk about the interview. We want to set up a time with our interview subject that is convenient for, well, really everyone, but them especially. When you arrive, don't rush straight into the interview, right? Visit, settle in. And while you're doing that, you want to have a conversation about your intentions for the information that you are gathering. Whether you're using this interview in a book that's just going to family members, or you're writing a county history for public purchase or anything else, it's a good idea to get the interviewee's permission to use what they tell you. And I realize it can feel a little awkward, especially when it's family. I did this with one of my, I'm going to do this. And I had that conversation with my aunt. It felt really, really awkward. But there's really good reasons, and there is a sample letter of permission for such a project in your handout, and you can modify and reproduce that to your heart's content. And there's others out there on the internet. It's like I said, you want to settle in, you want to get kind of warmed up, right? Visit helps everyone relax, and it builds rapport and trust, especially if this is somebody you maybe don't know very well. You're not interviewing your aunt, you're interviewing your third cousin that you've only met twice, right? So we want to build that. Now, keeping in mind that you could very well end up discussing the price of wheat in Scotland 20 minutes after asking what crops did your father grow on the farm, you want to prioritize your list of questions. You're going to have your questions. You're kind of going to want to prioritize them and try to ask the questions you most want answered first, unless you're dealing with a highly sensitive situation and you might need a little bit more easing into those. For instance, you don't really want to start an interview. I don't recommend starting off an interview with the first question of, did you have a child out of wedlock in the 1930s? Then you're not going to get unless that's the point of the interview, you're probably not going to get great response with that. Kind of work your way around that, right? If the person you're interviewing is older or tires easily, keep your session short. Don't ask or expect your 97-year-old mother to talk for an hour without a break. Actually, most people would prefer to not talk for an hour without a break. So, just kind of keep an eye on the time, build in breaks, make sure there's, some water handy, get up and stretch. You can always hit the pause button and start again. All right. Now, I find that it is very important to kind of guide our interviewee along and keep them more or less on task, going straight down the road towards your goal. And of course, your goal are those questions that you want answers to. But the reality is the person that you're talking to is going to meander, that it's going to happen. Don't jump straight away to interrupt them. Let them meander for at least a little while, because sometimes we get unexpected information during that walk down memory lane we never would have thought to ask for. It's very spontaneous. And if you jump and cut them off, you may never get that detail again or at all. Now, it's also quite common to end up with a whole nother list of questions that you would like to ask the person that has been inspired by that same meandering or the answer to your original question. It's up to you if you want to ask those immediately or wait for another time. Personally, I try to ask those follow-up questions immediately so that memory is fresh in my interviewee's mind. Okay, we're talking about my great-grandparents' courtship. We've wandered off into that. I'm going to ask those questions right away because that's where the person I'm talking to, that's where her brain is, right? Later they might go, oh, I don't remember that story now, or I don't remember that detail. But it's up to you. And sometimes, and I've done both. Sometimes like, okay, I'll make a note of that. That's not really, that's really a side thing to the conversation we're having. I can ask that later. Now, I've said a couple times things like pausing and hitting play. In bringing a recorder, I really recommend in recording your interviews. Okay. Believe it or not, recording the interview can help everyone kind of relax a little bit. You are not so busy taking notes that you miss details, forcing you to ask your interviewee to pause or repeat themselves, which interrupts the flow of the story. Okay. Recording also ensures that you don't write down the wrong piece of information. Or if you do, you can correct it. You go back to the interview and go, oh, she said 1943, not 1934. And since you're not sitting there taking lots of notes and you're not distracting them, your interviewee is going to feel like they're having a nice conversation with somebody who's genuinely interested in them and the answers, rather than feeling like they're being interrogated. And this benefits you as well, because a person who is feeling listened to and valued is, they're going to kind of get into it. They might get more complete answers, more detailed tidbits. All right, so by recording, you are creating an original record of the events and experiences of your interviewees. In some cases, you're also creating an original record of a firsthand account that is totally unique and that the whole story or parts of it may never have been published anywhere else. So you're creating that original record. And you're preserving way more than the facts of the story when you record a person speaking, whether that's an audio only or a video. You are preserving their voice, their cadence, inflections, accents, speech patterns. I talk with my hands. I know you can't tell that right now because I have my video off, but I talk with my hands. That's just part of me, and that's part of that. And hearing the cadence and the accent, it adds a whole new layer to your family legacy. I am profoundly grateful that my grandmother thought to record her dad telling a few of his stories. So I was 5 when he passed away. Can't really say I ever knew him. But I get to hear my great grandfather's own words, his own experiences in his own voice, and and generations in the future will hear that too. So hopefully I've convinced you to record your interviews. If so, we'll look at a couple tips for getting a good quality recording. And if not, tune out if you would like to for a few minutes or just kind of rest your hands. So the good news is gone are the days of bulky cassette tape recorders. And that actually looks very much like one I own. What are your options? You can pick up a small digital recorder. A good quality runs 20, 50 bucks. They're not expensive at any online website, basically, that sells these types of things. Just make sure that the model you choose has a USB connector so that you can transfer the audio files to your computer. I learned that one the hard way. I ended up when I was in a hurry and bought a recorder that had no external SD card and no USB transfer option. And I got the recordings off that internal hard drive, but it was a slow and painful process. So learn from my mistake. If you have a smartphone, you have a digital recorder almost certainly in your factory loaded apps. But if not, or if you don't like the one that came with the phone, there are dozens and dozens of them available in your app store. And that's whether you are an Android or an iPhone user. Most of those are free, so you can download one, play with it, delete it if you don't like the features, try the next one. Okay. There are some paid ones, and there are some out there that they're freemium, so you get a certain amount for free, and then you can pay to get some extra features. And there are a number of these now that will do an auto transcription. So as it's recording, it does an AI transcription, which can be a real time saver later down the road. You can also use your computer. The laptop is a recording device, which cuts out the middleman as far as transferring the data goes. If you record with a program such as Audacity, you can edit your file if needed, just right in that one program. No matter what method you choose, please be sure to back up your files. And if you have permission to do so, share them with your family so that you are also creating, you're creating that permanent record, that original record. But when many people have a copy, that reduces the odds that your computer getting hacked or getting stolen or just hard drive failing means that that it's gone forever. So even if you opt to use your computer or standalone recorder for interviews, it's my personal opinion. I do this myself. I recommend it to others. Have a recording app that you like and are comfortable with on your phone. That way, if you find yourself with an unexpected opportunity to capture a good story, you're out with your sister or something, and she starts talking about this thing that happened, you pull that app up and you don't miss the story. Well, that's a question. So some tips. And I'm going to add, because I don't think I have this in here directly, especially if you live in California, it is illegal to record someone without their knowledge and permission. So state laws will vary. You do want to be respectful of the state laws and get permission. But some tips. So we're going to assume you have that permission. Here's a few tips for getting the best quality recording. Do your best to record in a quiet space, not say a restaurant or a living room with small children playing around or somebody doing the dishes in the kitchen. Now, you may not be able to avoid all the background noise. Don't let that stop you, right? Just turn it on anyway. You might want to make a few notes, either during the interview or the minute you get home and have the opportunity to make some notes, especially at moments when volume spikes. I have a few recordings where my little baby cousin was fussy, and boy, those little ones, they can be they go from quiet to, oh my gosh, real fast. Place your device on a flat surface near the interviewee, but not so close that it's going to get bumped or knocked over by a stray hand. If you've got people who talk with their hands, you're going to make sure that that's out of reach. If you have a very quiet speaker, maybe invest in a lapel mic that just clips onto their shirt, so it's kind of unobtrusive, but that will increase the recording volume. You turn on your device and give a brief introduction to the recording. This is Sara Cochran. I'm talking with John Smith about his family history. It is 4:31 p.m. on March 7th, 2024. Have your list of interview questions with you. I recommend keeping it to really one typed page, maybe a couple of typed pages. You don't want to shuffle papers around during the recording if you can avoid it. It is a miserable sound to attempt to kind of hear through. If you're shuffling papers and somebody's talking, it really creates a lot of background static. It's not fun. Now, one last question before we answer before we move on. Now, some of you are thinking this, how am I going to get my oral history if I don't have anybody left to interview other than me? And that is it's a problem, or the person you want to interview is not available. Sometimes we can find oral history by researching in libraries and archives. They might have a local history collection that includes some oral history interviews. Many organizations, including the Showa Foundation and the Veterans History Project, interview specific groups of people, and these recordings can be listened to at their archive or online. Remember that original definition we had that includes recordings of persons who have a specific type of experience, right? We're trying to save the stories of what happened in the Holocaust. We're trying to save the stories of our veterans. We're trying to save the stories of maybe there's I think it's Kentucky, that folks who have an interesting genetic issue that their skin's blue. This is a very unique group. So we're going to talk to the people who have blue skin and learn what life was like and how that affected them in the world. All right. Don't overlook colleges and universities. Degrees that require a thesis. You might end up with a student who interviewed individuals for their project. My aunt did such a thesis as part of her anthropology degree, and she interviewed her father for it, and she saved those recordings, so now I can listen to them as well. So that's pretty awesome. And even if your person wasn't specifically interviewed, if it's the topic is something that your ancestor brushed up again, like farming during the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma, you want to listen to interviews with people who lived through that, because that can help you get an idea of what your person may have gone through. High school projects. Some high schools and their students, they get that family history project, and they might interview longtime residents of a community for a senior project. I was going through my grandmother's collections of newspapers clippings and discovered that way back in the 1970s, the high school class of this little town had done exactly that. The seniors went out and interviewed long-term residents, and one of the folks named in that article is my grandfather. Well, the interview tapes were still at the local library. And I went down there with my handy dandy tape cassette converter deck, and I got a copy of my grandfather talking about his early childhood, about his parents, about the community he'd grown up in. I was over the moon. All right. So we've got some oral history information, and now we kind of got to verify it. But what does that mean exactly, and why? Why do we need to do this? All right. Well, to verify, according to Merriam-Webster, means to establish the truth, accuracy, or reality of the claim, right? So we need to verify the story to separate fact and fiction. After doing thorough research, we will be generally able to classify our stories into three categories. Stories that are verified, meaning we're able to find documents and records that support the original story and kind of document the story. Unknown, meaning that we're unable to reach a reasonable conclusion as to whether the story is true or not, or maybe how much of it is true or not. And then we get the ones we kind of bust. The ones that fall apart under close scrutiny, and we learn that the facts are very different from the story, or in some cases realize that that's not even remotely possible. Okay. So why do we need to do this? Why can't we just trust that our families are telling us the whole and complete truth, and that truth has come down the generations without any alterations at all? Well, a few examples that highlight why we might need to why we need to try. We might have a little bit embellishment. You know, we're human. The story, the facts of the case, Joseph O'Brien was discharged from the British military and settled in Michigan, might be embellished a little bit to make it more interesting. To Joseph O'Brien deserted the British military by swimming across the Detroit River in the middle of the night. All right, so embellishment. Maybe make the past a little more palatable, maybe adjusting that marriage date to conceal the fact that the bride was already expecting when she said her vows. Differences in personal bias and perspective greatly influence a story. If the story is being told by someone who kind of is a general optimist that glass is half full, they're going to tell it in a different kind of a slant than somebody who's more of a pessimist that believes the glass is half empty. And remember, there's always at least two sides to every story, often more. And your informant might be missing some important detail that changes the story at a fundamental level. You know, it's just that's how this works. We have our own experience. When a lot of the time we may not have all of the pieces. And yes, we get some flat out outright lying. Okay, to hide a scandal or painful moment in the past, having a child out of wedlock, losing the farm to foreclosure, a divorced woman claiming to be a widow, all of those things, and many, many others. And we also want to keep in mind here that what was scandal and needing to be covered up in 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 150 years ago, that is not necessarily the same attitude that we would have today. If you have folks who were farmers during the American Great Depression, odds are really good that there may have been a foreclosure in your family. Those people who were foreclosed on because the economy had completely collapsed and there was simply no work and no money felt very differently about losing their farm and not being able to pay those bills than those of us who maybe lived through the Great Recession about 20 years ago. 20 years ago already, where it's like, well, the entire economy collapsed. It's not any individual homeowner's fault that they lost their home. This was a big thing. So the attitudes of the past are different than the attitudes of today. So we do need to be mindful of that. Sometimes we just get stuck in a falsehood, especially common with ages from my experience. Individuals have had plenty of reasons to make themselves older or even younger than they are on purpose, although certainly many people just simply didn't know how old they were necessarily. But you know, if it is on purpose, either way, the new age kind of has to become the truth to avoid any consequences of being found in the lie. So I'm gonna kind of get stuck in something there. We also have and I think we see this a lot with our family histories, passing along unverified information as the truth. My grandma Mary told her children and grandchildren lots of wonderful family stories in good faith that her mom had given her the correct information. And another, in some cases that goes down 2-3 generations where, you know, my great grandparents told the story thinking that that was right. Unfortunately, some of these stories aren't standing up to the test of research. Something went wonky in the pipeline. It wasn't malicious. It almost never is, but we have to be careful not to assume that the person who told the story has verified it first. And that's what we're kind of coming in and doing, is like seeing what's accurate, what's not, so that we can kind of stop that cycle. Sins of omission, or maybe protection. I have a set of great grandparents who were divorced in the early 1930s. My grandfather knew that this had happened, never told the wife or kids. You know, it was kind of, well, that was ancient history. It's not important. We're not going to discuss it, but it was an important piece of the family story. And once we learned it, because kind of some things clicked into place. Sometimes it's just a bad case of the forgetfuls. Details get left out or modified by accident, a simple misremembering of which grandma this story applied to, or transposing dates and places. Okay. I have a t-shirt that says, I'm a genealogist. I confuse the dead and irritate the living. So we get them all mixed up. Related to that, really, oral history is the ultimate session of the telephone game, right? Every time a story is told, the opportunity for error kind of creeps in. The statement, Samuel Knapp watched his brother William run in the Oklahoma land rush, changes over time to Samuel Knapp got land in the Oklahoma land rush, right? So some kernels, but some shifting as well. We have to keep in mind that the moral of all of this is oral history is passed down from generation to generation to generation. And most often, the stories that we are now working with and trying to figure out how accurate they are, we're talking second, third, maybe even fourth hand information. The person telling us these stories, they weren't there to witness the events. They may not have even known the people who witnessed the events. So researching the stories means we're going to go back to find the records created by those people who did witness the events to find out what they have to tell us. And in this way, we move the stories from fiction to nonfiction in our genealogy libraries. So this begs the question, how are we going to do this? Fortunately, we have the GPS to guide us, not the one that's going to take us to our nearest, favorite restaurant, like the one in our phones, but the kind that will help us get to the goal of determining if our family stories are true, partially true, or complete fiction. The genealogical proof standard is the result of an effort by the Board for Certification of Genealogists to establish best practices for our research. It guides us on how to build a case supporting the statements we make about our family history and help us reach a conclusion when the information we have is not precisely clear or disagrees from one record to the next. All right, so there's 5 steps or components of the GPS. We conduct reasonably exhaustive research. We craft complete and accurate citations, so we know where we got things. We analyze and correlate what we find. We resolve any conflicts as we find them, and we write up we have a sound conclusion, and we write it up so that other people don't have to guess. If this is new to you, I know it sounds a little intimidating, but it's not. It really, don't let it scare you off. As you get the hang of it, it will make more sense. And there's lots of lectures and resources out there that get into those. Which is good because we're only going to discuss in any great detail the first step of research and the third of analyzing correlating. And by the way, most of you, probably all of you, are already doing steps 1 through 4. Like you're doing it in your heads, you don't even realize it. It's that written part that gets me and a lot of people. Okay, step 1, research. We all know what the research is. The research is the fun part. But what exactly is reasonably exhaustive? Well, we have to start with a question. And then as we have our question, we're going to identify sources that are most likely to give us information to help us answer the question. All right. And then we're going to go do the research, go do the fun thing, and consult those sources to find what we want and what we hope to find. As a best practice, do keep a research log as you work. It will save you time in the long run, especially if you have to go back and see something again. So let's put this into practice with an example. Let us say that my research question is, when did my 3rd great-grandfather, Peter Kennedy, die? Okay, that's a pretty common one. When did somebody pass away? A list of possible records that are going to have information to help me answer this question. An obituary, death certificate, will or probate, cemetery records, maybe city directories, some land records, and of course, the oral history. Now, even though I put oral history last on the list, that's really the first place most of us are going to find information about this question, right? All right. Somebody has told us already that Peter Kennedy passed away in 1940. That he came to, again, born in Ireland, came to the United States, lived to be 100, died in Illinois in 1940. So, do I have an answer? Yes. Can I stop researching and declare this to be the fact? No. I have not done reasonably exhaustive research because I haven't looked at any of those other records we just talked about. I'm not being a responsible genealogist if I rest my conclusion only based on my grandmother's statement, no matter how trustworthy she might be. All right. So what do? We're gonna go verify it. We're gonna check this out. So off into the wonderful worldwide internet and assorted genealogy websites with my questions and my list of records. Now you'll notice, and I have lots of stuff. I have a telegram, which is in the family papers. I have obituaries, I've got tombstone, I have all kinds of stuff. I have lots of evidence here that agrees that Peter died in August of 1940, specifically the 30th. Now, whether or not he was 100 at a time is a whole nother question. All right, I do have some research to finish on this. Too many ancestors, so little time, but it's looking pretty good. All right, so let's look at an example where some of the information we have disagrees with other information. We got some conflicts. These are some of the documents I've located for great-grandpa Samuel. So not only do some of these records disagree with themselves, so the oral history gives me 2 birth years. The World War I draft card gives me 2 birth years. The death certificate gives me 2 birth years. I wish I could make these things up. I can't. But when we take a look down here in the census records and we go to the 1880 census, there is no Samuel in this household. If Samuel had been born in 1875, he should be living with his parents in 1880, right? Okay, well, he's not. So his absence is negative evidence, and it kind of pushes us towards the idea that 1875 is not correct. All right. This disagreement between pieces of information is why we have that fourth piece, which is to resolve our conflict. All right. So how else would information conflict? Well, there could have been a delay in the recording of information, so it was just kind of that memories fade issue. The person who gave the information might not have known of the correct answer, right? We get census records. The neighbors might have been doing the talking to the enumerator. If we're looking at an index or a second copy of a document, then someone might have made an error in the transcription. Whenever we find an index, we want to go look for the original record to see what's there. And even if the index is correct, I have yet to find a situation where I have an index, I go find the original, and there's nothing new. Sometimes it's not helpful new, but there's always something new. In the case of Samuel there, we had some issues with some math skills. People don't know how to subtract very well, and apparently it's genetic for me, so I always get my calculator out. But there is also the chance that somebody was fibbing about the information that they were provided. I'm going to be a little bit older so that I can or can't go to war, things like that. So really, before we make any statement about when Samuel was born, I got to figure out which of these pieces of information are most likely to be correct and why. Okay, so kind of at this little tip of the iceberg with the GPS there to why that can be helpful. So cautions before you start digging through the stories. I touched on this earlier. We have to be careful with avoid presentism, judging the people and actions of the past, of the mindset of right now. And that includes judging them, but it also includes making assumptions about how they were thinking about things, right? And what that would have done. Try to put yourself in the mindset of the era that you're researching in as you work. Somebody who is losing their farm because the economy has collapsed in the 1930s is going to have a different attitude about that situation than somebody who's maybe losing their house in that Great Recession of the early 2000s. So putting yourself kind of in their heads and in their shoes can actually help you find additional records, but can give you a better understanding of what's in those records and what your ancestors may have experienced. Remember that some stories will remain unknown for now, maybe forever. It doesn't automatically mean they aren't true. My helper here reminds us that justice is both blind and states that all are innocent until proven guilty, right? We don't want to pass along unconfirmed stories as facts, but we can certainly share them as possibilities. Because some future genealogists might be able to find the answers that we haven't been able to find on our own. We're going to do one quick just a fun case study because I'm looking at the time and I don't want to run too far over. But, this is the fun part. All right. As I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, sometimes we really hope the family story is not true. And I had a client come to me some time ago now, and I have permission to share this story. Um, the story goes, my husband's ancestor, A.D. Wellborn, married Iva in 1911, and he abandoned his family within a few years, leaving behind his wife and newborn son for parts unknown. All right. And disappeared. Well, Iva moves home with her parents and is listed as a widow in 1920. Okay, so AD died before 1920. Got it. And that was the story. That was that he had died, he took off and then he died. Well, my client had started digging and poking around and kind of trying to fill this in a little bit and discovered a marriage record in Alabama that fits right in there. All right, that's interesting. Now, Iva didn't pass away until 1946, so we'd really like to know what happened and answer the question if AD was a bigamist. And by the way, this is not the same AD as the newspaper article, just so you know. And if you look at that, we got some interesting overlap. It really does look like we got a bigamist here. So let's do some research. So my first question when I looked at what she had and I said, have you ever found anything about a divorce between AD and Iva? And she says, well, I haven't bothered looking. The family was adamant that he just took off for parts unknown. How could she have divorced him if they didn't know where he was? Okay. So off I go to the newspapers because favorite records. And I found two very interesting articles. The first one lists the case of Wellborn versus Wellborn that will be heard at the Superior Court in December of 1915. Now, that doesn't give first names. I don't know if it's them, but I do know that seeing the same last name could be a divorce. Enough to keep looking. And a couple months later, in February of 1916, the same case number appears in the newspaper, Wellborn versus Wellborn, plaintiff granted a divorce. Oh, that's interesting. I don't know if it's them yet. This next step is to contact the courthouse and request the documents to review the details to make sure we have the same couple, but it does look good. So let's take this and pop it into our timeline. We have the first marriage in 1911. We have a divorce in 1916. We have a second marriage later in 1916. Iva is listed as a widow. We don't know who talked to the enumerator. It might have been her parents. It might have been her. This is 1920. It's not socially acceptable to be a divorced woman in 1920s. So, and she's got a little boy, so she can't just claim she's single. So maybe there was a little bit of face saving there. Or again, we don't know who talked to the enumerator. Iva passes away in 1946, Betty in 1954. So was AD a bigamist in this case? Probably not. That was a really good resolution that my clients and were actually really happy about that. They're like, hey, for once we don't have, we got a good one. All right. Okay. So looking at the time, I'm going to go ahead and skip over to just a couple, it's a little bit of a wrap up, and then I'm going to leave time for questions. So what do we do when a story has been verified? Whether it's a story we were hoping that would be true or a story that we were kind of hoping it wasn't true when we find out, oh, it actually was. You can celebrate that you have figured out the actual situation, right? It's like this story is or isn't true. It is true whether we like it or not. So, well, at least it was passed down accurately. I have an ancestor that, the story was he died at Andersonville prison camp during the Civil War. That's not a fun story to confirm, but, we can honestly say we have an ancestor who gave his life for freedom during the Civil War. So there's a little bit of a silver lining there. Now, whether or not you have debunked the story, whether you've said, yep, this is definitely it, don't ever throw out the oral history. That was your starting point, and it's valuable to your research to keep the oral account with the documentation that either proves it out or frankly rejects it, because that story is out there. And if you've gone to all the work to prove or disprove it, Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Keep that so that future generations will have the benefit of what you have done to figure out that story. Now, you might over time have someone whose stories tend to just kind of prove out like that, your aunt so-and-so, she tells you stuff and you can prove it, and she is just accurate most of the time or all the time. You can have more confidence with the stories that they tell you, that you can't find anything to prove out, right? You think, okay, I can't document this one, but everything else has been pretty spot on. We don't want to declare that one you can't document as oh, yep, definitely. She's got a 99% verified rate. We're just going to take it. Don't do that, but you can have more confidence. Don't get overconfident, right? You want to try to confirm the story. The stories and information passed down in our families remain at the heart of our genealogy, and they're critical to understanding the lives and experiences of the generations who helped us to get where we are now. Their joys, sorrows, trials, and accomplishments can teach us so much about ourselves and each other, and they can really help guide the future generations. So I hope I've inspired you to start gathering, preserving, and then researching out and verifying, or maybe not, your stories of your family. And with that, I will ask if we have any questions. I will say if someone has a question later, sometimes, asking in front of a group, especially when it's being recorded, my information is on the handout on the screen. You're more than welcome to send me an email, and I will do my best to get you an answer. Yes, so there's a comment in chat, which is a great one. If you have, one or more siblings or one more than one family member, and you're kind of all having a group conversation, that can actually give you a lot of great additional details because, one person will say, oh, well, no, it was, we had this, and somebody else, oh, yeah, that's right. And you remember how we did this? And so they do, they kind of feed off each other and bounce ideas. And I've done that. I've got a lot of recordings like that. You do run into a larger problem of potentially having people kind of talking over each other, which it happens. So either if you do that, maybe kind of before you start, go, pretty please kind of watch that, or just have a piece of paper so you can, with that same, if you've got background noise, talking over each other's kind of background noise, to make some notes so that when you are doing that transcription, you can kind of sort out the two speakers a little bit more effectively. I've been there, done that too. But yeah, that's a great question about that, or comment.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on March 14th with Bob Taylor. He will be giving a presentation entitled United States Research with the Family History Guide. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fh_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.